everyone, and welcome back to the Divorce and Mortgage Strategies podcast, brought to you by the Divorce Lending Association, and I'm your host, Jody Bruns. Today's conversation is especially meaningful for me because I'm joined by someone I have had the privilege of knowing and collaborating with over the past few years, Andrew Hatherley. Andrew is the founder of Wiser Divorce Solutions. He's a certified divorce financial analyst and the host of his own podcast, the Gray Divorce Podcast. But beyond the credentials, he brings something that's often missing in the world of divorce, a deep sense of care for the long-term well-being of his clients, especially those over 50 who are facing divorce later in life. We will make sure to include all of his contact information with this live episode. But today, we're going beyond the divorce decree and exploring what happens after divorce for seniors. What does life look like when you're suddenly rethinking your housing, your income, or your identity at a time when you thought you'd be settling in, not starting over? So whether you're a professional who works with divorcing seniors or someone walking through this chapter yourself, this conversation is going to bring real value. Andrew, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jody. Thank you for having me back again.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you and I have had multiple discussions in the past about gray divorces. We've talked reverse mortgages. We've talked how to help spouses over the age of 50 prepare for divorce. But that's where I want our discussion to be different today. I would like to talk about what comes after divorce for seniors. You know, how do they redefine security, their housing, even their identity, right?
Right.
So I have a question that I just thought maybe we could start off with. You know, in your experience, because I know you work with them before, during, and after, what do you think is the biggest emotional and financial challenge for people facing divorce later in life?
Well, getting divorced later in life, as a financial advisor, I tend to lean towards the financial element. And late life divorce, the key is late life, you don't have the time to recoup all those savings that you've built up. If you're getting divorced at 60, 65, you're seeing your net worth cut in half, and you may be already in retirement, or you may be just a year or two away from retirement. So I know personally, I went through my own gray divorce, and a lot of the feelings that I was feeling, I see in my clients. And I had to completely rethink what retirement meant to me, my relationship with money, because half of it went away, and what brought me happiness. And so there was quite a lot of rebuilding, but rebuilding in a relatively limited time frame, because when you're getting divorced in your 20s or 30s, you know, you can continue to stick all your money in a 401k and invest aggressively because you've got the time to ride the ups and downs in the market. But later in life, it's a real shock to the system when you're faced with rethinking what the last third or a quarter of your life might look like. And of course, that's the financial aspect, but emotionally too. In many cases, people going through late life divorce have been married for 20, 30, even longer years in many cases. And so this requires a complete emotional realignment. And the idea of, will I get married again? I hear, I'm never getting married again all the time.
I said that once upon a time.
You said that was, you know, I give myself some credit, because when I got divorced at 52, I never said I'm never going to get married. I said, it ain't happening anytime soon. It took a number of years. And fortunately, as I like to say, there's life after gray divorce. And I met a beautiful lady, and we've been married now for 4 years. So there's life, there's love, there's good things. And we'll get into that, I'm sure. So the two components, really. The legal component's been dealt with. The divorce is finalized, but you've still got the financial component where you're rethinking your attitudes towards money. You may be suffering some real anxiety about it because your income, your net worth's been cut in half. The emotional component, of course, about, am I ever going to meet somebody again? And of course, you've got relations with the family and friends, longtime family and friends, people taking sides. And unfortunately, you see this a lot with adult children in gray divorce, siding with one parent or the other, and friends likewise. So those are the key categories of concerns, the financial and the emotional.
I work obviously with a lot of financial advisors in the divorce area. And I always see more of them focused on the woman in the divorce. And it seems like there's a feeling out there that the woman in the divorce is coming out more financially vulnerable. Maybe they weren't the ones in control of the finances. And I get that. I've seen that in several of the clients that I've worked with, especially if you're working with the older divorcing seniors where that was just how it was done. I do sometimes feel like there's the men are left, to, I don't want to say deal with it on their own, but they're not given that much of the spotlight,
Yeah.
and some of the men that I've worked with going through divorce, they do suffer still.
Sure.
We're not just talking finances here,
Right.
but I think the man is left to more silently suffer. And when you were just talking about, there's often a split or a division in friends and family. And if they've been in a marriage for 30, 40, heck, sometimes 50 years, and now they're getting a divorce, it is like a big chunk of your life now you can't access because I have these two friends, Paul and I do, Brian and Diana, love them to death. And my kids always joke that if mom and Paul ever get divorced, mom gets Brian and Diana in the divorce.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that? Do you think that there's more focus on the woman in divorce, especially in gray divorces, and how do you think that the man is left to either, stand up to this identity that, you're strong, you're big, you can, deal with it more silently? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great subject for discussion because yes, I do feel that the effects of divorce on men have been understated. Probably because I think you can't argue that women statistically tend to come out of divorce a little less well off. That might be because they haven't been the one handling the finances in the family. They may not have been working. They may have to go back to the labor force, and they're going back to the labor force at an older age. And, there's still sexism in the workforce as well, so they may not get paid as well. So, the statistics do show that women tend to pay a higher economic penalty in divorce than men do. That's not to say men don't pay an economic penalty. I saw half of my net worth disappear in the divorce. And it took some while and I recovered and everything's great now. But, men suffer as well economically. But I think Jocelyn Crowley, I believe is the lady's name, who wrote a book on gray divorce, refers to the economic penalty and the social penalty of gray divorce. And we've just discussed the economic penalty more often, typically hitting women harder than men. But the social penalty is not much discussed. And as you said, with respect to relationships with adult children, the maternal bond tends to be stronger. And there may be, because mom is paying a higher economic penalty, the kids are siding more with her or spending more time with her. Of course, you can't discount the importance of the maternal bond as well. Men tend to suffer a greater deterioration in relationships with adult children and relatives in the family. They tend to suffer greater loneliness in divorce than women do. I think women find it easier to make friends with other women than men do with other men. Men are always kind of cagey with other guys, and there's always a kind of little competitive aspect, and it takes a while. Bonds can, strong bonds can grow, but men aren't likely to reach out or express their emotions to other men as much as women are with other women. So that leaves them feeling a little bit more isolated typically than women would. And this is not to say women don't suffer this social penalty in divorce, but relatively speaking, I think it hits men a little harder. And when you look at the marital dynamics, particularly with gray divorcees who maybe grew up in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, where the wife was the social coordinator, the one who put the dinner parties and the visiting friends and visiting relatives plans together. There's an element of the man being somewhat adrift socially, not having this social facilitator there anymore. He's left to his own devices. And it may not sound important, but it all builds up, all these elements of isolation. And with so much of the focus in divorce on the legal and the financial, the emotional is always kind of put as maybe the third tier. And it really shouldn't be when you consider that numerous studies have been done on happiness and what really contributes to a happy, contented life. I think Harvard's been doing a study for about 100 years on this, and the results are clear. It's not money, it's not even health, which are both important. It's relationships and communication with loved ones and friends. And if you don't have those, then you're typically going to be struggling. And certainly the statistics on lifespan and suicide and addiction hit men harder post-divorce than they do women. So yes, I'm a certified divorce financial analyst and a lot of CDFAs. I think the majority of CDFAs, I know the majority of CDFAs are women, and they tend to gravitate to women. They're maybe not as tuned in to this dynamic, or they may have gone through their own divorce experience and not come out of it particularly favorable to the male attitude, approach, or point of view. But
men going through a great divorce, do they reach out to a CDFA? Do you see like maybe the cases where you're working with the man in the marriage, you're also working with the women? So there's more of a collaborative process there, or are there some men who seek out the financial advice independently in divorce?
there certainly are. Of course, the stereotype, and having been a financial advisor since the 90s, I've worked with a lot of married couples, and typically the man is the one who asks the questions and drives the proverbial investment bus, sometimes to the family's detriment. They're more attuned to financials, typically. Not always. I mean, I've got many clients where I've got strong, independent women driving the financial bus, but in general, it tends to be the man. Unfortunately, in many cases, they think they know more than they do about investing, and they tend to be more focused on performance. They want to, it's the competitive nature of men. They want to beat the S&P 500 or beat the market or beat the index, whatever. So that approach or that mentality lends to the man not reaching out so much. However, I will say that most of probably 65% of the people that approach me or the people I work with are women. And I think largely I'm referred by other attorneys. Women, they refer women to me because, I'm a big believer in consultation and education. And I think I'm a very good listener. And so I think that's why I do get attorneys do refer a lot of women to me. When it comes to people reaching out to me, I've noticed in the past couple of years that the pendulum is balancing and it's probably 50-50 male, female. And I think the reason for that is that I'm 2.5 years into the Great Divorce podcast now. And we've got 69 episodes up right now. I've had every month, at least one person will call me. And the last few months, it's been a man saying, "Hey, I really like your podcast. I listened to a lot of episodes. Can we have a chat?" And I think the reason is that I've addressed some of these issues on my podcast. perhaps appeal to people like me. I'm soon to be a 62-year-old divorced, well, happily remarried, but a gray-haired. This is where I got most of my gray hair too, my 9-month divorce. But I think they recognize somebody they can safely talk to who's going to understand their concerns. And a number of the podcast episodes, in fact, the next podcast episode will be focusing on men going through divorce, not to the
Nice.
exclusion of women, but
Yeah.
as you said, Jody, men's concerns tend to be underappreciated because there's this idea that they don't suffer in divorce, which is nonsense.
Yeah, I would agree. So obviously, I'm in the housing market on the mortgage side of things. And we've talked in the past about is a reverse mortgage appropriate in this situation or not. And that's not the conversation I want to have. I want to know what do you see as, post divorce and regarding housing, with divorcing seniors? Do you see more of one spouse staying in the marital home, or do you see them selling and both downsizing? Because there's got to be struggles with that, not just financially, just emotionally, giving up the ties to maybe the family home that's been their home for years and years and years. What do you see from a housing perspective? What the typical path is, if you will, for divorcing seniors in that
Right.
in
I
that
don't have any hard and fast statistics. It's an interesting question, and I hope somebody out there would come up with some statistics on this. Maybe tweak some of the people in the divorce
yeah.
lending world. That would be a great survey. I will tell you anecdotally and what my gut feeling is based on the many cases I've worked with divorcing people over the age of 50 is that I see less of a tendency to keep the principal marital home than I would somebody divorcing in their 30s, 40s, or maybe early 50s. And I think the principal reason for that is children in school. I
Mm-hmm.
think I think you see in younger divorces, I think you quite often see the mother wanting to stay in the family residence with the kids for the benefit of the kids. And I hear this all the time, we just want to see them through high school.
Yeah.
Well, in gray divorce, they're seen through high school. And in many cases, I think it depends if it's still the original marital home and there's just two people in it now and they're getting divorced. Well, you're dealing with the issue of there's two people in a pretty big house. Do you need this house? And do you need the attendant expenses associated with this house? If there's a lot of equity in the marital home, potentially it could be sold and the cash split between the parties could be used for a down payment on a home equity conversion mortgage for purchase, which would leave the parties without having a mortgage over the age of 62, where reverse mortgages really apply. So you've got the reverse mortgage kind of carrot dangling out there, no mortgage payments. Now, of course, if the house is paid off, there's no mortgage payments, but you've
Yeah.
got expenses with a 4,000 or even 2,500, 2,000 square foot house, when really a 1,300 square foot condo would be great and not require nearly as much money to upkeep. It's interesting. We're all familiar with the term the empty nest syndrome,
Yeah.
when the kids leave the home and the parents are kind of all alone in the house. Well, there's a step beyond that. And the empty nest syndrome can happen. Let's say it's a 45 or 50-year-old couple getting divorced and the kids are out of high school or off to college or whatever. But if you look at a 65 or 70-year-old couple, they're facing not only an empty nest syndrome, but what I call the crowded house syndrome, because one party or both have just retired. So not
Mm-hmm.
only are they sleeping in the same house 24/7, and that can be a contributor to a lot of stressors in a marriage, particularly if one or both of the parties is retiring or has retired, but has no, I say retired, I mean left their job, but
Yeah.
they don't have any real plans of what to do with their day and how to live life. And this is a key component of the discussions I have with people going through gray divorce, is that you've got to have something to retire to, not just retire from, in order to have a meaningful, purposeful life, going forward after your career.
I would almost feel or think, I haven't, not there, fortunately. I would almost think that a divorce later in life, you know, would almost be very similar emotionally to the loss of your spouse. We were just talking about them. They're in their early 80s and they have a decent sized house. They want to downsize. I've told my dad, I said, if something was to happen to mom, you could still change the light bulbs. You could still fix the furnace. You could still do this stuff. But if something happened to mom, she couldn't do that. She would have to hire somebody to come in and do that. And it's very sad for me to even think about something happening to one of them. I'm fortunate that I have both of them. But you would think that a lot of the divorcing seniors, they have to go through that same emotion. And it's the same thing if you have the senior woman wanting to keep the house and she's relied on her husband to do all of this stuff around the house. They don't see that side of keeping the house when sometimes they need that neutral party, whether it's you, their attorney, someone like me on the mortgage side. If we're having that conversation, really have those open heart to heart discussions about what it really means to keep the marital home, or even if you're selling and you're going to downsize, are you going to be able to do that? Or maybe depending on your age, your lifestyle, whatever, do you go to like a senior, I'm not talking a nursing home or anything like that, but more of a senior
55 up
yeah.
or independent living. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a very good question. You make a very good point that widowhood and divorce are similar in the emotional impact they can have. Everybody's different.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it depends on the individual, but they can be great stressors. I think if you take the financial out of the question, I mean, the financial circumstances of taking care of the house or not having a mortgage, the potential benefits of reverse mortgages, that can be a strong influencer in making the decision to leave the house. In many cases, people will stay in the house, and let's say it's the wife typically. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. If it's all things being equal financially, I'm not sure if that's a good thing from an emotional standpoint or not. I could see that perhaps not too much change at once might be a good thing, and to take it slow and maybe to process the divorce and then see how things are in the house and then maybe downsize after that. My father passed away 5 years ago, and my mother was 82 at the time. She's still alive at 87, but she's in a three-story townhouse. It's not that it was too big, although it probably was a little too big for her. It was just navigating 2 flights of stairs, and I nagged her for a long time. Maybe she didn't want to make that break. I haven't gotten into this discussion with her, but I'm thinking about it now and thinking maybe she didn't want to, with having lost her husband, didn't want to lose the house at the same time. But eventually she came around, and I think we got what I mentioned before about connection and communication and friends. 2 years ago, she moved into a very nice independent living condo, which also has the assisted living and the memory care in the building. Fortunately, she's still in the independent living phase, but she's going to yoga classes. She's on all these committees. Their girls are going out for drinks. She's still driving,
Wow.
and she's pretty darn happy. And I think she's happier than she was being alone in the house because she's getting that communication with people, the friends, with people her like age. Although it's funny because when she was living in the townhouse, there were lots of kids in the neighborhood. And she'd always be grumbling like typical little old lady. All those kids getting in the way, blah, blah, blah. Of course, now that she's living with a bunch of seniors, she goes, all these people are old. I said, Mother, you're 87. She goes, well, I don't think like an 87-year-old. These people are half dead, blah, blah, blah. So you can't win with your mother sometimes.
Well, one last question for you. What advice would you give to someone who is newly divorced over the age of 50 and maybe they're feeling overwhelmed about starting over at not only this age, but this stage of their life?
Well, that's great because a great question because I know I was divorced relatively young age of 52. Or was it 53? I think it was 53 when it finally happened. But I remember about a year after that, I was a little down in the dumps because this didn't work out and now I got to rebuild financially and emotionally. And so there were a couple of things. I think the first thing is you've got to take care of your health. And I'm happy to say it. I'm about to turn 62 and I'm far better shape physically than I was at. So I committed, and you don't have to be a gym rat, but I just committed to get a good night's sleep, wake up with some energy, cut out the caffeine, start with walks. And then I ended up, and I still do work out with a trainer 3 days a week. The physical and mental benefits of pushing weight in the gym with a trainer or in your garage are just really powerful and they help you get a good night's sleep. It's kind of the old story of diet, nutrition, exercise, and sleep, but I found that put me on a solid foundation emotionally and physically. You start thinking clearer, and then you can focus on the financials. And what I found with financials is, there's two great financial tracking measures, the budget and the net worth statement. Budgets are no fun, but it's a good idea to do a budget after divorce to really make sure that you're living within your means.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes, and this happened to me when I emerging from divorce, I needed to buy a car. My car was long past it. So I did buy a car, and for the first time ever in my life, I financed it. And to me, that was terrible. I hate financing cars. I hate taking out a loan on a depreciating asset. So I made a point to eliminate all debt, and that was the first one I focused on. And just like a laser focus, all the extra money from paycheck went to paying off that, and I had to sacrifice some vacations, maybe not as many ritzy steak dinners as I was accustomed to, but it sure felt better when that debt was paid off. And related to that, budgets are no fun. I know that. But net worth statements, this is where I geek out as a financial guy. And I give this advice to everybody, and I hope they take it. Emerging from divorce, you've got a net worth statement. Eliminate the part of the net worth statement from before the divorce because you're now dealing with probably half. And so to make yourself feel like you're making progress, you're not going to rebuild that to where it was overnight. It's going to take some time. And that's another discussion altogether is about the importance of money and happiness in your life. I think it requires a recalibration as well. But focusing on the rebuilding, I created a spreadsheet of my net worth, which is essentially my assets, the equity in the house, money in retirement accounts, money in bank account, checking accounts, and liabilities. And there was a car loan, which I hated. No other debt because I never dealt with credit cards during the marriage. After credit cards were an issue, I wanted to pay that down. And so I just updated it every quarter. I have copies of this going back to 2015. I keep track of this net worth statement on a quarterly basis. And since 2015, it's gone up every single quarter. I make sure of that. And of course, your house is another asset. So it helps if your house is growing in value. So your house, your retirement accounts, if that's where you're putting your money, not only saving cash, but paying down debt. By paying down debt, you're reducing a liability. So by making the size of that liability smaller, your retirement account, your assets may not be growing much, but if the debt's going down, your net worth is still increasing. So to me, that's the type of magical math I like. That gave me a good positive reinforcement that things were on the right path.
Cool. So I know you have something to share with our audience before I wrap up and close out. What is it? What you got?
Well, I've just recently, within the last month, produced this very readable 12-page guide to the Great Divorce Phenomenon, how to create financial independence after mid to late life divorce. You can see it's not
Very
overwhelming
nice.
with text, lots of colors and white space. So if anybody wants a copy of that, please feel free to email me at andrew@wiserdivorcesolutions.com, or visit my website, transcendretirement.net. And the other thing is, I'm a member of the Amicable Divorce Network. If you want to hear more about how the Amicable Divorce Network works, I interviewed the founder of the group on the Great Divorce podcast, which can also be found at transcendretirement.net. And I contributed 3 chapters to this great book that Tracy Ann Moore Grant, the founder of the network, put together. 80 topics with 40 divorce professionals in there. I wrote 3 chapters, one on gray divorce. It's called Divorce Amicably, Your Roadmap to Resolution, and you can find that on Amazon.
Yeah, we love Tracy Ann, so that's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. Andrew, I always walk away from our conversations very inspired, but today especially, you've reminded us that divorce later in life isn't the end of the story. It can be the start of a more empowered chapter, one grounded in wisdom, strategy, and real peace of mind. So if you're listening and obviously want to learn more about Andrew and his work, I encourage you to visit wiserdivorcesolutions.com. We'll include all his contact links below the show, and turn into his Great Divorce podcast. It's really good. You'll find incredible insights and guidance there from him. If you're a professional looking to strengthen your impact in divorce, housing, and mortgage strategies, especially for older clients, visit us at divorcelendingassociation.com. I'm Jody Bruns, and this has been the Divorce and Mortgage Strategies podcast. Be sure to follow the show, share this episode with someone who needs it, and join us next time as we continue bridging the gap between family law, finance, and the home. Thank you again, Andrew.
Thanks, Jody. Great to be here.
Thanks.